Hey Artnerds, today we're doing a tutorial on how to paint this little watercolor illustration here. We're going to be completing today's watercolor illustration on Sienna hot press watercolor paper. I want the end illustration to look like it was a lineless watercolor technique, so I can go in and add line work if I feel like it needs additional contrast. So I'm doing my underdrawing with pink color Eno lead. This also allows me to do my sketch stage and go right into watercolor without waiting for the inks to cure. So I'm doing a little bit of constructive anatomy using this pink colored lead. And you guys might remember a few moments ago I showed you the paper and I showed you what other tools I was using. I had a little thumbnail doodle to kind of serve as my guide. So I'm not coming up with this illustration entirely on the spot. I did a thumbnail illustration first and I'm working from the thumbnail. So I blocked in Kara's figure first and now I'm blocking in the jars in the foreground. These jars are going to be containing red beans and rice respectively. Once I have the jars in the foreground established, I start sketching in the Christmas lights that are lighting this scene. So Kara is in her mom's pantry, and as you guys probably already know, Kara is a Lilliputian girl, so the scale on everything is really unusual and fun. In the background, I'm drawing small burlap bags that contain things like corn and acorns. And Kara herself is holding some dried lavender stalks. Those of you who read 7-inch Kara know that her pantry, her mom's pantry, has all sorts of preserved and dried goodies up. So I'm drawing some dried minnows. I'm also going to be drawing some dried pearl onions, as well as some teeny tiny dried chili peppers. Now just imagine how hot those would be. Kara herself is tiny, and supposedly the smaller the pepper, the more spicy it is. So those would be some fierce little peppers, maybe Thai bird's eyes. Then I'm going to draw some sage, and then I'm drawing some rosemary, and you guys will notice that I'm just kind of blocking everything in really loosely. I'm also going to draw some mint hanging sporadically throughout the pantry. Mint is going to help with the smells, but it's also going to help keep insects like ants out of the pantry. I know some people have probably wondered how a tiny little dollhouse kept in a shed can possibly keep the pests out. Well, if they don't become pets, then they are chased out by mint, or perhaps they're even eaten. So you guys will notice I'm roughing everything in first, and then I'm going in and adding tinier details. So I drew an oval shape to indicate where the lavender was going to go, and now I'm breaking it down into the individual lavender buds. I'm also using this as a chance to tighten up Kara's hand so that it's easier to tell how she's holding the lavender itself. Now that the basics have been sketched in, I can start going back in and tightening up some of the details, starting to draw Kara's clothing, as well as the objects inside the jars, as well as the latch mechanism that's holding these jars closed. I'm also using this as an opportunity to erase some of the pink lines so that things are a little bit easier to see, and so that there isn't so much pink on the illustration when I start watercoloring, because while it will dissolve into the watercolor, it will also kind of influence the color of the watercolor. So with the Sienna hot press paper, it does have less tooth than the Sienna cold press, but it is still very soft, and if you're using a mechanical pencil, it can be very prone to catching the lead. I did have some rips and tears, but with the style of illustration I used for this piece, there were no really noticeable detrimental effects to this. I'm also using a drafting brush to remove any stray eraser shavings so that I have a cleaner illustration. You want to remove these entirely before you start watercoloring. So now that the sketch is just about completed, I've decided that I actually want to ink this and then watercolor it. So I decided to use the the Sakura Pigma FB. It's one of my favorite brush pens that happens to be alcohol marker proof and waterproof. And it has a really teeny tiny brush tip on it. So I love working with this and I highly recommend this material. And you guys will be able to find links to everything used in this video down in the description below if you'd like to do a little bit of shopping. So when I'm inking, I like to start from the front and work my way backwards. And I'll also often use a blotter piece of paper or a piece of tracing paper to protect the illustration itself from the ink smearing or from my hand getting oils on the paper. Now usually the face would be the first thing that I ink on a person, but Kara's hands are really important in this illustration and I want to make sure that I correctly convey how she's holding the lavender, so I inked those before I started inking her face. And next I'm inking the lavender since it overlaps her face as well as her dress. And since her bangs overlap her face, I'm inking those before I begin inking her facial features. And you guys will note that I twist and turn the illustration all over the place. This is to get the inking angle that is most comfortable for my wrist. I highly recommend you guys do it. Sometimes when we're recording time-lapse videos or videos for YouTube, we try to keep the illustration static because we know that's better for the viewer and you guys can more clearly see what we're doing. But since this was an illustration for me that I happened to record, I wanted to do what I need to do the best job with it. I also want to point out that this has been sped up many times to fit in underneath an hour. I believe it took me about 3 hours total to complete this piece. So now that we have most of the major foreground elements inked, I'm going to start working on the elements in the background, beginning with the minnows that are hanging from the rafters. And I'm keeping my inks for this illustration really simple because I want to allow the watercolors to shine. When inking the background, I worked my way from right to left. That way I'm not dragging my hand as much across the page. And then I begin inking the details inside of the jars. So now that our illustration is inked, I'm going to allow it to dry overnight, and I'm going to leave the majority of the pink lines visible while watercoloring. So to watercolor this piece, I'm using the Moz Art Komorebi set. If you're interested in this watercolor set, I have a couple of reviews here on this channel, but I use it fairly frequently, and I like using it for standalone illustrations such as this one. I approach watercolor much in the same way that I approach drawing or inking, in that I begin with the largest shapes and then I work my way increasingly more detailed. So I have kind of a burnt sienna mix that I'm applying to the walls of the pantry. And this is based off of the Pantry in 7-inch Cara, my webcomic. So even though I'm not working from reference, I definitely have a strong idea of how I want things to look and where this piece is going. While that layer is still wet, I dab in a thicker mix of burnt sienna. And one of the really nice things about Shizen watercolor paper is that both hot press and cold press are cotton rag, and they are both papers that retain water for a long period of time. So you're going to be able to do wet in wet techniques for a while. Next, I begin painting in the circles of yellow light around the Christmas lights, as well as some ultramarine blue for the tops of Cara's eyes. I'm also painting in a little bit of indigo where cast shadows would be from the light. So I want to keep it light at this point and work it progressively darker later on. And the reason I'm adding shadows now is I'm using a really light wash of this color. If I were to wait until later on in the illustration, there'd be a high chance that it would activate the existing colors and might cause bleeding. And sometimes I want that because it sometimes loosens up a piece, but sometimes I don't. And this is one of those instances where even though I'm working a little bit loose and I'm doing this as a sketch and I'm working on a paper that really facilitates thinking of your art as a sketch and working looser, I still want to control some aspects. I'm also applying that same shadow color, so it's kind of like a light Paynes Gray wash, to the glass in the foreground. I give that a chance to soak in, and then I dab in a little bit of a thicker mixture of the same Paynes Gray. One of the nice things about the Komorebi set is it includes 40 pans of watercolor. You receive some neons, you receive some metallics, but the rest are really nice convenience colors. So if you enjoy doing watercolor sketching, the Komorebi set has a lot of the colors you're going to need already mixed for you. So now I'm using the Paynes Gray to establish darker shadows, and keep in mind that watercolor dries lighter than it goes down. And I'm also, this is not a sponsored video, this is not a paid for video, I just happen to like the Komorebi set and I happen to enjoy using it. And I think it's a good watercolor set for watercolor semi-beginners or maybe watercolor artists who are looking for kind of an all-in-one set. Just generally, it's a solid watercolor set of Gansai style watercolors. So I'm adding the Paynes Gray now into the shadows on the objects in the background. I'm sort of establishing my shadows early on so I don't have to worry about painting shadows in later. This is sometimes called underpainting, and it's a really handy technique. If you like to work on cheaper papers, this is a really important technique to know. I'm also applying a little bit of the Paynes Gray into the lavender stalks and onto the background burlap sacks as well. So while the Paynes Gray on the glass bottles is still wet, I'm going to start painting the rice. And I'm dropping in some burnt sienna and allowing it to diffuse. This is going to create softer shadows. Now, you may think of rice as being white, but it does have kind of a creamy color. So even if I was painting white rice rather than brown rice, you'd still see a bit of creamy color in the shadows. As for the red beans, I've mixed together a little bit of a Venetian red with their cherry red and a little bit of purple to get that nice, really dark red color that red beans have. I'm also painting Paynes Gray onto the thumbtacks that are holding the mint leaves on in the background, and I'm using a bit of a warmer yellow ochre to paint the pearl onions. And you can use a little bit of paper towel to lift out some of your paint, and it'll also give you kind of a diffused look. Next, I'm using a little bit of a stronger mix of yellow in the light bulbs just to kind of help give that glow effect. And I find that painting a very light version of the color with a bit of a darker version of the color in the center kind of gives that glow effect. And I'm using yellow ochre on the burlap bags in the background. We're starting with a light wash because I want to start developing shadows. And you guys can see that I actually painted through the glass, so you can see some of the yellow ochre through the glass. As I continue to develop the yellow ochre on those sacks, I am not going to continue to develop that same color on the yellow ochre that you can see through the glass. This is one of the ways that I create the illusion of transparency. I'm also painting in a little bit more Paynes Gray on the grains of rice, further extending the illusion of shadow. Since the light is more towards the background, more of the foreground objects would have heavy shadows or heavier shadows on them. And I'm adding a bit of a darker mix of yellow ochre to the burlap sacks. Now I'm using that same Paynes Gray to do a kind of an all-over paint job on the minnows. Minnows are kind of a silvery color, sometimes they're a brown color. It kind of depends on what kind of minnows you have and where you live and what actual species of fish they are. Since minnow isn't a species of fish, it's just kind of a catch-all term for tiny fish like this. You guys will notice that I'm leaving a bit of rim lighting, i.e. the paper I'm painted where it's closest to the light source. And while it's still wet, I'm dripping in a little bit more of the Paynes Gray just to give kind of a diffused shadow. I'm also applying a little more Paynes Gray to the thumbtack itself, as well as to the metal findings on the glass jars. So now I'm going to start painting the chili peppers, and I really want to develop some fun colors here. So I start with an orange red, and while it's still wet, I'm going to dip in some more concentrated bluer red. And maybe even a little bit of purple just to help develop the shadows. As for the sage green, I'm adding more of the Paynes Gray to the sage leaves and give that a chance to dry. And I'm also painting in just a little bit of shadow onto Cara using the same color. Basically, this was a good opportunity for me to kind of reevaluate where I'm putting the shadows, how the shadows look, and how I might want to continue to develop them. So now I'm using a green gold to start painting in the sage leaves. And a darker sort of undersea sort of green, a blue-green for the rosemary leaves as well. And I'm adding a thicker mixture wet into wet and allowing that to diffuse. If you're looking for a good wet into wet paper, Shizen, both the hot press and the cold press are excellent for that. Now I'm adding in a little bit more red since the chili peppers have had a chance to dry, and I'm establishing more shadows. Now I'm using kind of a harsh delineation between the layers to better establish shadows, and I'm doing the same using kind of a red ochre for the onions as well. And I'm adding a bit of burnt umber to the tops of the feed bags just to start creating the sense of form. So at this stage, most of the background colors have been established, so all I'm really doing is working on further developing those colors, applying additional layers, that sort of thing. And we're also using kind of a really nice bright green. It's more of a blue kind of green to paint the mint leaves, just to give kind of that minty flavor. I know that if they were dry, they would actually be much lighter, desaturated, more brown, but when we're painting illustrations like this, we're really trying to paint evocatively. So now that we have most of the background elements painted in, I'm going to start painting Kara. You can see on her foreground arm that there's a little bit of a paper tear. It's not particularly noticeable in the finished piece, and I didn't find that it was really harmful to the painting itself. I mixed up yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet for her skin tone, and as I wait for that to dry, I'm going to continue to develop the items in the background. What you guys can't see on camera is I'm using a small daisy wheel palette for a lot of my color mixing. I am also working on an impervious craft mat. I know it's ugly, but it's great for mixing colors. I'm using a little bit of the same green that I used on the rosemary to paint the caps on the Christmas lights. I know we've moved on now to LED Christmas lights, but there's something really nostalgic about the lights that I grew up with. I'm painting the lavender with a light wash of purple, and then while it's still wet, I'm dabbing in a more saturated version of the color, allowing it to blend wet into wet. And I'm also painting the stems on the lavender green while the purple part is still wet, and encouraging that to blend wet into wet as well. So I get kind of a gradient transition. Now I had a little bit too much dark purple on my lavender stems, so I'm lifting a little bit up with a bit of Vivo paper towel. I'm continuing to develop and add in those shadows in the background as we go, since watercolor is really about kind of reevaluating as you continue to work on the piece, as you develop the piece and add more colors. So you guys will probably see a lot of back and forth from me. Once things have had a bit of a chance to dry, I go into the lavender now that it's dry, and I start establishing darker shadows in purple, taking care to leave the buds as still distinct and unpainted. So basically what I'm doing is I'm painting purple into the shadows. And I'm going to do the same thing with the minnows using Paynes Gray. So I'm establishing the darker shadows here, keeping in mind that the light, those little Christmas lights, are our light source. So the shadows are going to be moving away from those lights unless there's something directly blocking the light. I'm also painting small scale shapes, just little half circles, onto the fish as well. Once things have had a bit of a chance to dry, I go in and I paint another layer of Kara's skin. And I may have mixed it just a little bit more dark since I am trying to develop some color and some shadows here. And since although she's facing us, she's sort of facing away from the light source, I put a lot of the shading on the front of her face. Now before we get too many layers into our skin tone, I'm going to start applying the blush as well as the shadow color, and I'm using a red violet as the shadow color and kind of a cherry red as the blush. So I'm applying the blush first to her eyelids, her cheeks, her lips, underneath her neck, basically anywhere skin covers skin. I've talked about this in a lot of tutorials. And I'm going to let that dry before I apply the shadow color, which is kind of that red violet. Although I did do a little bit of wet into wet on the neck just to kind of soften that transition because it seemed a little bit harsh. So now that the blush has had a chance to dry, I'm just kind of intensifying it just a little bit. Add a little bit of darker red to the tops of her cheeks, right underneath her eyes, and then blend it out with clean water. And she's wearing a white dress. And when you're painting white dress in shadows, you have a few options. We could have gone with Paynes Gray. We could have gone with like a warm cream color or a warmer pink color. But I decided to go with French ultramarine or an ultramarine blue as our shading for the white. So since she's facing away from the light source, most of her dress is going to have that light blue wash. And then once it dried, I added a darker layer of that wash. Painting lights is often about establishing shadows and using the shadows to just show off how bright or how light the lights are. So next we're going to start painting her hair. I'm using my favorite Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush for this since it's got lots of snap and doesn't have a tendency to drip. And I'm using burnt sienna and I'm leaving loads of white highlights, particularly towards the back where it's closest to the light. And I'm using just a little bit of paper towel to pick up some of that brown. I'm also adding in darker French ultramarine blue shadows to her dress, kind of accentuating the pleats and the areas of shadow. So at this stage, just about everything is blocked in, and we're really just focusing on developing our forms, working increasingly tighter, and adding shadows and details. So from this point, it's going to be, I hope, pretty evident. I've left a bit of rim lighting on Kara's dress to show that she's being lit from the back. And I'm just continuing to develop that white using ultramarine blue. For the darkest shadows on her dress, I'm using a very thick mix of ultramarine blue. And something I really like about Shizen paper and the Komorebi watercolors is you can see a bit of granulation, and it's really quite beautiful. I'm also using a really dark mix of Paynes Gray on the fish to kind of delineate them. And I'm going in and adding a bit of Paynes Gray to our mint leaves as well as to the tops of the burlap sacks. Then I'm going in and I'm adding an even darker mix of purple, maybe even purple mixed with a bit of Paynes Gray onto the lavender just to continue to develop those shadows since Kara I wanted to give the impression that she was in kind of a dimly lit room, but I think the end result is just a little bit too bright to be quite that impression. And a little bit of darker shadow under her neck, which I promptly lifted up because it was a little bit too much. So I find that at this stage, it's really important for me to do a lot of evaluation, for me to take time and take a look at what I'm doing and think about it and then make changes from there. And something I've noticed about myself when I'm doing watercolor for you guys, when I'm recording my watercolor, is if I'm talking or if I'm concerned with the recording aspects of it, I don't do as good a job as I would if I was just painting it itself. It like takes up the wrong part of my brain. So I'm using a darker mix of the burnt sienna to do another layer on her hair and on her eyes, and I'm also painting in her freckles at this stage since I'm not really going to be doing any large scale glazes. I established those a little bit earlier on. And I'm also painting in some more shadows on the burlap bags using kind of a burnt umber or burnt umber with a little bit of Paynes Gray. At this point, I'm really trying to establish the shadows without going so far that things get muddy or overly heavy-handed. I want it to be dark, but I want it to feel emotionally light. Almost said lightheaded, but emotionally light, tonally light. For the darkest shadows on her hair, the Komorebi set doesn't really have like a Van Dyke brown or a sepia brown, so you need to mix, I mixed a bit of burnt umber or maybe even burnt sienna with black, and that way you can get a dark enough brown for Kara's hair in the shadows. And it's really important to establish those shadows because that's what we're really using to show where the light source is and how the light source affects the objects in the room. So at this point I was pretty happy with the piece and I didn't really want to overwork it, so I opted to start using white gouache to add in some highlights, particularly where the light is hitting objects directly. This is also a good opportunity to add some white back into her dress and add some white highlights on the glass, since glass is highly reflective. I also decided to do a little bit of re-inking once everything had had a chance to dry. So I went back in with my Pigma FB just to re-establish some of the lines and add in just a little bit of additional weight, line weight to things that I'd inked. Some of the things got a little bit lost, got a little bit muddy as I was painting or as I added white highlights. So re-inking just a smidge is a good way to kind of re-establish your black balance, and it also helps cure muddiness. Alright, my friends, that about wraps it up. This piece is completed and I think it turned out really cute. I hope you guys enjoyed helping me paint it today. I hope you found this tutorial to be helpful, useful, and inspirational. If you did, let me know down in the comments below. I love painting for you guys, and it would mean a lot to me if you'd check out 7-Inch Kara at 7inchkara.com or 7inchkara.tumblr.com. If you like what I do, make sure you hit the subscribe button and click the bell notification so you don't miss any updates. I have loads of reviews and tutorials here on this channel designed to get you making comics, painting, and using alcohol markers. If you'd like to support what I do, you can head on over to patreon.com/nattasoup and join the Art Nerd community. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys again really soon. Have a great day, guys. Bye. Bye!